All right, pottery students, I'm going to go over some pottery basics with you. Some of you have already heard this a little bit in class. What I plan on doing with our pottery class is providing some resources that you can do at home. And then when you come to class, we'll start the project. So you'll already know what you're planning to do on your off day, and then when you come on your on day, you can get clay and we'll begin to start the projects. All right, here's some pottery basics. Clay is an earthy material of fine grained minerals. It comes from the dirt. So many regions, like for example, Red Wing, Minnesota, is known for their pottery because of the clay that they got from the riverbed. Bricks and pottery and vessels that were made a long time ago oftentimes came from clay that is in the ground. Um, this modern day clay oftentimes has new materials that they've added to it to make it more conducive to what we do with making things. But it goes back a long ways. So potter's wheels appeared in history about 4,000 years ago, but most of the methods that were done in ancient times were hand building with pinch and coil methods. So there are different ways and techniques that are available to use. We'll be doing both and learning both hand building and wheel work. Hand building kind of has three categories: pinch pots, and we will be doing that at probably at the beginning. Coil pottery we kind of covered in Intro to Art, and we will not be doing that, but since you have had that in your past, you are welcome to incorporate coils in your hand building that we do in the future, as well as slab building techniques. So the slab building techniques will roll out slabs and create boxes and containers and things like that using that hand building technique. So one very important principle to do is wedging your clay. And so I'm going to, in class and as well as include this clay wedging video for you to view and to review how to wedge clay. It is important, especially when we have clay that we have not, that's kind of been thrown in a bag, or the clay that I use and pug oftentimes does have air bubbles in it or inconsistency. So it's really important to wedge the clay so once you begin all the hard work of making something, that you don't run into problems with chunks or things or air bubbles in your projects. We don't want any projects to end up exploding in the kiln. All right, so there's various stages of clay. The first one is slip. Slip is a liquid form of clay. We'll be using it in class to, when we're joining clay to clay, we'll use slip to kind of help act as a cement. Clay is also used in this format in molds. So many of your manufacturers that create items like multiple mugs that are all the same, they use a mold for that, and they put liquid clay in those molds and then form the objects that way. Now, when we refer to clay that is plastic, we're basically saying it's workable. You're wedging, manipulating, and sculpting, throwing on the wheel. You've got plastic clay that is fresh out of the bag, is not too dry. But then at some point when we're wanting to do some carving or things like that, leather hard is where it's just slightly a little bit more dry. It's not too soft and mushy. You've got a little stiffness to the clay that allows carving and stamping and building to be a little bit easier. I do want to say that once we do get into slab building, that you don't want a soft slab and a hard slab attaching to each other, or like a hard cup and you're adding a very soft handle. It is important that the clay is of a similar consistency when you're joining them together, because they are shrinking when the moisture is being released and it's drying out, you've got some shrinkage there that cause things to fall apart if they're not similar in their level of dryness. And then you also have your bone dry clay. And bone dry clay is where you don't really want to be working on it at all. It's in the on the kiln shelf, drying out and ready to be fired. It tends to be the most fragile, so you really don't want to be carving or trying to sand it down or do anything like that. One, if you sand down bone dry clay, you're going to be producing a dust that you don't want to be breathing. So bone dry clay is where it's ready to be fired and there's no longer any moisture in the clay. All right, so and there's three types of clay, and I will be having a little quiz in Canvas to kind of quiz you on these stages of clay. One is greenware. So before anything is ever fired, it's called greenware. And greenware is something that can also go back to wet clay again. It isn't easy to moisten a project to get it soft again. That can take some challenges if you're trying to get something moist again so you can still work with it. But it is something that you could put in the slop bucket and with water and it would disintegrate back to the slump of clay that it used to be. Now, once something is greenware, it hasn't been fired yet. So then once we've had our greenware, it's kind of a light gray color, we're going to fire it. And that is a bisque firing, and it's usually about 1900 degrees. And it is no longer, it changes state. It does go through a chemical change, and it becomes a ceramic. And so you wouldn't want to put something like this in the slop bucket because it's not going to turn back to the mud that it was before. And it's called Bisqueware. It's unglazed, doesn't have any glaze on it yet, and it's called Bisqueware. And then we apply glaze to it, and it's called Glazeware. And we will fire it again at an even higher temperature, 2300 degrees usually, and it will melt the surface glass. It's kind of a glass component that allows this to melt and become glossy and shiny. And then you can also eat out of it. All right, so joining pieces, you always want to score, slip, and press things together. And the reason that you do this is as the clay shrinks, if it's not scored or cemented together well, it will just fall apart. So sometimes if you add an ear to a piece that has a head, and if you haven't scored it and slipped it, it will, as the moisture releases and shrinks a little bit, those pieces will fall off. So it's very important to rough up the surface by scoring and then add some water or some slip to that space and then kind of press them together to make sure that there is a nice clean join there. And then you can clean it up a little bit with a sponge. All right, here are some tools that you'll find that you'll use for taking a big chunk of clay off of a larger chunk. You use a wire, or you'll also use that on the wheel. Here are some needle tools and fettling knives that we'll use, and modeling tools, carving, modeling, and we'll use these on the wheel as well as on our hand building projects. And here's a rolling pin and guide. If you're an at-home student, I gave you a small, tiny rolling pin. You can also use a rolling pin if you ask permission to your mom. Just make sure you clean it off really well, maybe thoroughly a couple times before you use it again for cooking. All right, drying. So when we have a project and you are finished and you're absolutely sure you're finished, you're going to put it in the drying cabinet in the kiln room on the shelf. And it does need at least 7 days to fire. I like things to be thoroughly dried out before I put them in the kiln, just to ensure that there isn't any trapped moisture or air bubbles that will cause an explosion or a piece to fall off if it's trapped. So as I mentioned, firing, we initially do a low firing, bisque firing. It's about a 1900 degree firing. And then when we apply glaze, the high fire glaze oftentimes are 22 to 2300 degrees. Fahrenheit. Whenever we glaze, you'll see this symbol on a glaze, and most all of my glazes, there's one glaze that is not food safe. It does not mean that you can eat the glaze. It does mean that once it's fired, you can eat off the object that you made. So if you made a cup or a bowl, all of our glazes are food safe. I do have one that is metallic in nature and it is not food safe. So we will probably be having a discussion whether or not you should use it for a cup. What happens is when you put like a hot liquid in something that is not um, uh, food safe, you may leach some metals, and so you don't really want to drink anything like that on a non-food safe glaze. All right, here are some rules to kind of go by when we're working with clay. Make sure when you have worked on a project that you wrap it in a plastic bag and put it in your locker. If you have a long weekend and you're concerned about something drying out, I would even add a layer of wet paper towels to the project to make sure it stays moist. You don't want to drown a project. Sometimes if you've got too much water on something, it will kind of disintegrate or work away some of the clay that you're working with. And also be aware that clay dust is something that you do not want to breathe in. So if you've got a lot of clay on a surface, I would use a wet sponge to clean it up. Clay should be, your project should be no larger than your thumb. You really don't want something with very, very thick walls. There, you risk, the thicker a project is, you risk of the it not drying out thoroughly and having an explosion. And also make sure that you've scored and slipped clay that is moist and similar consistency of dryness for the best results. Make sure you wedge clay before you work with it. It just always is a good thing to do before you're working with something so you don't run into frustrations. All right, so and also when we get to glazing, don't glaze the bottom of the piece. Wash the piece off before you glaze. Oftentimes if something seems dusty, give it a little rinse before you glaze it and let it dry out thoroughly. Handle your project with two hands at all times because you never know, you might drop it and you've worked so hard on it, and if it hits this hard floor, it's a real bummer. And also never handle somebody else's work because if you break it, it's really a drag. So those are the basics of clay, and we're really going to have fun this year. I look forward to it. Happy clay.